Coumar Persad, we need you to step away
I
from the
didn't do
station.
anything. I don't know what you're talking about.
40,000.
Once is a mistake. Twice is suspicious. Coumar Persad and Davon Webb did this across 9 years and 7 years, respectively, and left a phone call, a taped bag, and $23,980 in cash sitting in a Queens apartment for investigators to find.
Dollars taken from a checked bag containing
You
$170,000.
X-rated this morning?
No,
I
that's not what
scanned
happened.
hundreds of bags every shift. I never
Phone
touched any
records show
cash.
you called Davon Webb.
The investigation had started inside the building. Another transportation security officer at John F. Kennedy International Airport had watched what was happening on January 30th, 2011, and walked it up the chain. That single act of reporting brought Port Authority police to the American Airlines terminal, to 2 uniformed officers, and to a bag containing $170,000 in passenger cash. By the time the case was over, the 2 men in this footage would admit to stealing approximately $160,000 from passengers' checked luggage across a combined 16 years inside the busiest international gateway in the United States. Quick question before we go any further. When you hand your suitcase over at the airline counter and watch it disappear down the belt, do you actually know who touches it next? Sit with that for a second. Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time to fix that. We cover stories like this every single week, the ones where the people in uniform are the ones doing the stealing. And the only reason anyone ever finds out is that one colleague decided not to look away. Coumar Persad was born in 1966 in Queens, New York, the son of immigrants who had come north from Guyana in the years after the country's independence. The Indo-Guyanese community he grew up in was already one of the largest in the United States, anchored by the wave of South Asian Caribbean families who had settled into Richmond Hill, Ozone Park, and the stretch of Jackson Heights west of the Elevated 7 train. The Persad family lived in a 2-family house with a narrow driveway and a flag of Guyana taped inside the front window. His father worked in transportation. His mother kept the house and helped at a relative's grocery on Liberty Avenue. Coumar was a quiet child. School transcripts from Richmond Hill High School describe a student who attended consistently, scored in the middle of his class, and did not draw attention. A note in a guidance counselor's file from his junior year called him polite, dependable, slow to volunteer. After graduation, he took a series of working-class jobs, stocking shelves at a Pathmark on Atlantic Avenue, driving a delivery van for a Queens electronics distributor, working overnight security at a warehouse a mile south of JFK. He married in his mid-20s. He and his wife had 2 children. They bought a small house in Jackson Heights with a finished basement and a mango tree in the backyard that never quite produced fruit. Davon Webb was born in 1979 in the Bronx. His mother was a home health aide. His father was, for most of his childhood, absent. He grew up in a 3rd-floor walk-up on a block where the bodega on the corner was the social center of the neighborhood, and the courtyard between the buildings was where everyone gathered on summer evenings. He attended public schools in District 9, played pickup basketball at the park near Crotona Avenue, and graduated from a Bronx high school in 1997. He was the kind of kid teachers described as smart but distracted, capable of high marks when he chose to do the work, indifferent to the work the rest of the time. After high school, Davon worked retail. He was a stockroom hand at a department store in the Bronx, a cashier at a gas station on Webster Avenue, a bouncer at a small lounge on Fordham Road. He had a daughter at 22. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment a few blocks from his mother. By the early 2000s, he was looking for the kind of steady job that came with health insurance and a pension, the kind of job his mother had always told him to find. In November of 2001, In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, Congress passed the Aviation and Transportation Security Act. The legislation federalized airport security. Where private contractors had previously screened passengers and luggage at American airports, the new Federal Transportation Security Administration would now take over the work, employing a uniformed federal workforce trained to a single national standard. The first transportation security officers were sworn in across the country in 2002. The first JFK hires went through orientation at a training site in Glen Cove and at the airport itself. Coumar Persad was in that initial wave. He applied because the job was federal, the salary was steady, and the location was 20 minutes from his house. Persad began as a checkpoint screener and moved within his first 3 years onto the checked baggage side of the operation. By 2005, he was assigned full-time to the X-ray machines that scanned passenger luggage after it left the airline counter and before it entered the baggage handling system. The job was, on paper, exactly what the post-9/11 framework demanded: a federal officer with the training to identify weapons, explosives, and prohibited items inside a sealed suitcase, working in a secure area passengers never saw. His evaluations described him as attentive to procedure, reliable on overnight shifts, and respected by his peers. He was promoted twice. He stayed at JFK. Davon Webb joined the agency in 2004. He had heard about the openings from a cousin who worked airline ground crew at LaGuardia. The TSA was hiring aggressively, the pay was decent, the benefits were real, and the work was steady. Davon went through the training and was assigned to JFK's American Airlines terminal, where he worked the baggage belt area. The side of the operation where checked bags, after passing through X-ray, moved through a system of conveyors and sorting equipment toward the aircraft. He learned the building. He learned the shifts. He learned which cameras worked, which cameras did not, and which areas a supervisor was likely to walk through on a given day. By 2010, Coumar Persad had been with the agency for 8 years. He had a federal pension accruing, 2 children in the New York City public schools, and a wife who worked part-time at a dental office on Northern Boulevard. He drove a paid-off Toyota Camry. He went to work at the same terminal every day. Davon Webb had been with the agency for 6 years. He had moved out of his mother's neighborhood into an apartment of his own. He had a girlfriend. He had a daughter he saw on weekends. He drove a used Honda. On paper, both men were exactly the kind of federal employees the post-9/11 system had been designed to produce: stable, credentialed, vetted, in uniform, and accountable to the agency they had sworn an oath to. Neither one of them, in any record investigators would ever find, had a prior arrest. Neither one of them had a complaint in the agency's internal files. Neither one of them had ever been flagged on a performance review, called in by a supervisor, or written up for a policy violation. They were, in every administrative sense, 2 of the approximately 50,000 officers the TSA would later refer to in its press statement as the dedicated workforce that kept the traveling public safe. To understand what happened at JFK on January 30th, 2011, you have to understand how checked baggage actually moves through an American Airlines terminal at the busiest international gateway in the United States. When a passenger drops a checked bag at the airline counter, the bag is tagged with a routing label and placed on a conveyor that disappears behind the ticket counter. From that point forward, the passenger never sees the bag again until they pick it up at their destination. What happens in the meantime is invisible to them, and largely invisible to anyone outside the small federal workforce assigned to handle it. The first stop after the counter is the checked baggage inspection system, or CBIS. The bag enters a large, inline X-ray machine that produces a high-resolution image of the contents. A Federal Transportation Security Officer sits at a screening station behind a monitor and reviews each image as it appears. The officer's job is to clear bags that show no threat and to flag bags that require a physical search. The job is not to inventory the contents. It is not to record what the bag contains. It is to identify weapons, explosives, and prohibited items, and to either clear the bag or hold it for further inspection. After clearance, the bag continues on a conveyor into the baggage handling system, a maze of belts, slides, sorters, and carousels that occupies the lower floors of the terminal. The bag is routed by its tag toward the appropriate aircraft. It is touched in the course of that journey by a small number of TSA officers responsible for monitoring the flow and resolving jams, by airline baggage handlers responsible for loading the aircraft, and by no one else. Passengers cannot enter the area. Cameras cover most of it, but not all of it, and the coverage is patchy enough that any officer who works the floor for a week knows exactly where the blind spots are. The trust framework in the system is total. The federal government tells passengers, at every step of the process, that the people handling their luggage are federal employees, vetted by background investigation, trained to a national standard, and accountable to the Department of Homeland Security. Passengers are advised not to lock their bags with anything other than a TSA-approved lock. Passengers are advised that the agency may open and inspect any bag at any time. Passengers are advised, implicitly, that the workforce on the other side of the counter is the workforce the federal government has chosen to handle their property, and that the workforce is therefore trustworthy. The X-ray officer sees what is inside the bag. The baggage handling officer can intercept the bag in the system. Both positions are, individually, positions of considerable institutional trust. The pairing of the two positions, coordinated phone contact, communicated information about a specific bag, physical access to the bag once flagged, was the operational structure of what Persad and Webb were doing inside the American Airlines terminal at JFK by 2010. The agency's monitoring of that workforce was, in 2010, primarily reactive. There was no live audit of X-ray screens. There was no statistical flagging of officers whose checked bags showed elevated incidents of damage or loss. There was no routine reconciliation of passenger complaints against the officers on duty at the time of the alleged loss. When a passenger reported that something was missing from a checked bag, the report typically went into a queue at the airline first, was forwarded to the TSA's claim office, and was resolved through a small cash payment, or denied entirely. Officers were almost never identified, almost never investigated, and almost never disciplined unless the complaint involved a sum large enough to attract law enforcement attention or a pattern severe enough to attract internal affairs. In 2010, that absence of routine monitoring was the gap Coumar Persad and Davon Webb had been operating inside for years. The exact date of the first theft is not in the public record. What investigators would later piece together was that the pattern had been running for years before January 30th, 2011. By their own admissions at sentencing, Persad and Webb, together, had taken approximately $160,000 from passengers' checked bags during their tenure at TSA. The $40,000 that triggered their arrests was a single incident inside a larger operational practice. The mechanism was straightforward. Persad sat at the X-ray station. He watched the screen. Most bags contained clothing, toiletries, shoes, and the predictable contents of a checked suitcase. Occasionally, a bag contained something that, on the X-ray, registered differently. a dense, rectangular, layered shape that did not match any of the standard contents was, to a trained eye, sometimes a stack of currency. Cash on X-ray has a particular signature. A bundle of banded $100 bills, especially in quantity, produces an image that an experienced screener can identify on sight. When Persad saw something on the screen worth taking, he made a phone call. The call went to Davon Webb, who was working the baggage belt area on the other side of the X-ray machines. The call was brief, a description of the bag, a description of the contents, a description of where the bag was in the system. Webb walked over to the conveyor, located the bag, and marked it. The marking was simple, a small piece of tape applied in a specific position, visible to anyone looking for it, invisible to anyone who was not. The bag continued on through the system marked. At a point in the routing where Persad could reasonably appear without raising questions, he entered the baggage handling area. He found the marked bag. He opened it. He removed some portion of the cash, enough to be worth the risk, not so much that the loss would be impossible to overlook. He resealed the bag as best he could and placed the bag back into the flow. The removed cash went into a box. Persad carried the box to a bathroom in the terminal that both men had identified in advance as a location with adequate privacy. Webb met him there. The two men divided the cash and concealed it in their clothing. When their shifts ended, they walked out of the terminal through the employee exit. They went home. The variations on this template, across the years it had been running, were minor. Sometimes the X-ray hit was small enough that only one of the men took the risk of opening the bag. Sometimes the contents were jewelry, electronics, or watches rather than cash, and the operation adjusted accordingly. Sometimes the call between them did not happen because the timing did not allow it. The constant was the two-position architecture, eyes inside the bag via X-ray, hands on the bag via baggage handling, and the discipline to take less than the full contents so that the passenger, opening the suitcase at the destination, would either not notice immediately or would not be sure when the loss had occurred. What Persad and Webb did not understand, what no officer running this kind of scheme ever fully understands, was that every step they took was leaving a record. The X-ray machine archived an image of every bag scanned. Every phone call between their personal cell phones produced a record at the carrier. Every entry into the baggage handling area by an officer carrying a federal badge registered on door access systems. The cameras in the corridors and in the terminal recorded movements that, individually, were unremarkable and that, collectively, formed a timeline. None of those records were being actively reviewed. All of them were being created. The personal financial side of the operation was equally exposed. Persad had been bringing cash home to his Jackson Heights house. Webb had been doing the same in his Bronx apartment. Neither man's federal salary, in the high five figures, supported the lifestyle either was beginning to lead. Persad had paid down debts. He had funded a renovation. He had bought small things, a new water heater, a flat-screen television, a used minivan for his wife, paid for in cash or in money orders that, traced back, would resolve to cash. Webb had done similar things on a smaller scale. The pattern was the kind of thing a careful audit of either man's finances would have surfaced immediately. But the audit was not happening. There was no agency program at JFK in 2010 that reconciled officer lifestyle against officer salary. There was no internal affairs investigation looking at the checked baggage operation. There was no routine intercept of high-value bags or systematic flagging of incidents in which passengers reported missing cash. The system that should have caught Persad and Webb was, in every operational sense, not looking. And so the operation continued. Year after year, bag after bag, the two men kept finding small windows in which the architecture of the agency they worked for allowed them to take what was inside. By the time January of 2011 arrived, both men had developed a kind of operational confidence, the confidence that comes from having done a thing many times without consequence, and from having convinced oneself, by repetition, that consequence will never come. The bag that came through Coumar Persad's X-ray machine on the morning of January 30th, 2011, contained $170,000 in cash. The bag itself was not unusual on the outside. It was a standard piece of checked luggage on an American Airlines flight out of JFK. The passenger had checked it at the counter and walked away. The bag traveled the conveyor to the CBIS area. It entered the X-ray machine. Coumar Persad was at the screening station. What appeared on Persad's monitor was a rectangular mass with the unmistakable layered density of bundled currency. He had seen the signature before. He had never seen this much of it in a single bag. He picked up his personal cell phone and called Davon Webb. The call was brief. Persad told Webb about the bag, where it was in the system, and what it contained. Webb walked over to the conveyor, found the bag, confirmed what Persad had described, and marked it with tape. A short time later, Persad entered the baggage handling system area. He found the marked bag. He opened it. He saw inside, on his own account, approximately $170,000 in cash. He removed $40,000. He placed the cash in a box. He carried the box to a bathroom in the terminal. Webb met him there. The two men divided the $40,000 and concealed it in their clothing. They finished their shifts. They walked out of the terminal at the end of the day with $20,000 each in cash on their persons. The bag, with the remaining $130,000 inside, continued through the baggage system and was loaded onto the aircraft. The catalyst that ended the operation was not an audit. It was not a passenger complaint. It was not a security camera review or a routine internal affairs inquiry. It was another transportation security officer who had observed something. The available reporting does not name the colleague. What the case file makes clear is that another TSA employee at JFK, working in or near the American Airlines terminal that day, saw or learned enough about what Persad and Webb were doing on January 30th to conclude that it could not be ignored. The colleague went to a supervisor. The supervisor listened. The supervisor took the report seriously enough to escalate it. The supervisor contacted the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Police Department, the law enforcement agency with jurisdiction over the airport. Port Authority detectives opened an investigation that same week. Take a second here, because this is the part that matters. The system that should have caught these officers, the cameras, the audits, the federal supervisory chain, none of it caught them. 9 years for one of these men, 7 years for the other. The only reason this story has an ending is that one colleague, whose name has never been made public, decided to tell a supervisor what was happening. If you believe accountability stories like this deserve more attention, hit subscribe before we get into the investigation. The way this case actually closed is something most coverage never shows you. The investigation, once opened, moved quickly. The Port Authority detectives pulled the X-ray images for the bag in question and confirmed that on January 30th, at the time Persad had been at the screening station, the X-ray machine had imaged a bag containing approximately $170,000 in cash. They pulled the phone records for Persad's personal cell phone and located a brief call to Davon Webb at the exact time the bag had been moving through the X-ray. They pulled the door access logs for the baggage handling system area and confirmed Persad's entry shortly after the call. They began compiling the case. The passenger whose bag had been opened was identified through the airline routing. The passenger had, on arrival at the destination, opened the bag and discovered that approximately $40,000 of the $170,000 in the bag was missing. A report had been made. The report sat, as such reports often did, inside the airline's claims process. But it was now corroboration for what the Port Authority police were already investigating. The Port Authority detectives worked the case across the first 2 weeks of February. The evidence converged from multiple directions, each piece independent, each piece pointing at the same two officers. The X-ray image archive was the first pillar. Modern inline baggage X-ray systems retain images of every scan for a defined retention period. When detectives pulled the archive for January 30th, 2011, the image of the bag containing the cash was there. The image showed in the unmistakable layered density of bundled currency, approximately $170,000. The image had been on Coumar Persad's screen. There was no question about what he had seen. The phone records were the second pillar. Persad's personal cell phone had placed a call to Davon Webb's personal cell phone at a time that, when overlaid on the X-ray timeline, fit precisely with the window between the bag scan and Webb's appearance at the conveyor. The two officers had no legitimate operational reason to be in direct phone contact during their respective shifts. They had radios for that. The personal call was the kind of communication officers used when they did not want the conversation on the federal network. The door access logs were the third pillar. Persad's badge had been used to enter the baggage handling system area at a time consistent with the timeline of the theft. He had no operational reason to be there. He had been there long enough to find the marked bag, open it, and remove the cash. The bag itself, recovered after the airline located it at the destination, was the fourth pillar. The tape Webb had used to mark it was still in place. The interior showed signs that it had been opened and resealed. The $40,000 was gone. The fifth pillar was the cash itself. Armed with search warrants, Port Authority officers entered Coumar Persad's home in Jackson Heights on February 16, 2011. Inside, they recovered $23,980 in cash. Persad, when asked about the missing $20 from the round figure of his share, told officers that he had used it to buy food. The recovery from Webb's Bronx apartment, combined with the recovery from Persad's home, accounted for $39,980 of the $40,000 taken from the bag. Approximately $20 was unrecovered. The sixth pillar was the cooperating colleague. The TSA officer who had reported the conduct gave a formal statement. The statement laid out what the colleague had observed: the call, the marked bag, the trip to the baggage handling area, the bathroom meeting, the cash divided. The colleague's account corroborated the physical evidence at every point. The investigation also began to surface the broader pattern. As detectives interviewed both officers and reviewed their financial records, the operational practice that had run for years before January 30th came into view. Cash deposits inconsistent with federal salary. Purchases inconsistent with reported income. The pattern of opportunity, bag after bag, year after year. The same two officers in the same two positions. By the time the investigation moved toward charging, prosecutors had enough to support an admission of approximately $160,000 in theft across the officers' careers, far exceeding the $40,000 from the single bag. The arrests came on February 16, 2011. Port Authority police detectives executed the search warrants at both officers' homes in the morning and took both men into custody. Persad was arrested in Jackson Heights. He was at home when the detectives arrived. He opened the door to officers holding a warrant and a court-authorized entry. He stepped back into the entryway. He did not resist. The officers showed him the warrant, walked through the house, and began the search. Persad sat at his kitchen table with one officer while the others worked the rooms. When the cash was recovered from the location inside the house where he had stored it, Persad spoke. He acknowledged the cash. He acknowledged where it had come from. He answered, when asked about the missing $20 from the round figure, that he had used it to buy food. He did not, in that initial interview, attempt to deny the theft of the bag. The lead detective sat across from him. "You know what this is about," the detective said. "I know," Persad said. "There's a bag," the detective said. "We have the X-ray, we have the phone call, we have the entry log, we have the cash in your house. There's no story here that fits the facts other than what we already know." "I understand," Persad said. "Tell me about Davon Webb." Persad paused. The investigators had not been certain, going in, that he would speak about his partner. They had been prepared to work the case from his end alone, but Persad, in the kitchen of the house he had bought and renovated with the proceeds of years of theft, answered the question. "Davon was on the belts," he said. "I called him, he marked the bag. I came down and took the money. We split it in the bathroom." The detective wrote the statement down. He asked Persad to confirm it. Persad confirmed it. The detective asked whether this had been the first time. Persad did not answer. Webb was arrested at his apartment in the Bronx the same morning. The interview at his apartment was shorter. He acknowledged the bag, acknowledged the call from Persad, acknowledged marking the conveyor, and acknowledged dividing the cash. He, like Persad, did not initially offer additional incidents, but the financial records, the deposit history, and the operational pattern would, in the months that followed, produce admissions to a far broader course of conduct. Both men were transported to the Queens Central Booking Facility. Both were processed. Both were charged the same day with grand larceny, obstructing governmental administration, official misconduct, conspiracy, and criminal possession of stolen property. Both were arraigned and released on bond, on the condition that they surrender their federal credentials and not return to JFK or any other airport in the Port Authority's jurisdiction. The TSA terminated both men's employment immediately upon learning of the arrests. The agency issued a statement that day. "The disgraceful actions of a few," the statement read, "should not reflect negatively on the approximately 50,000 TSA officers across the country who work each day to keep the traveling public safe." The agency noted that, as of February 2011, 12 officers had been fired nationally for theft from checkpoints or checked baggage. By 2014, that figure would exceed 400. The case went to the Queens District Attorney's Office. The lead prosecutor reviewed the file, the X-ray archive, the phone records, the door access logs, the recovered cash, the cooperating colleague's statement, the suspect's own statements, and concluded that the case was, in evidentiary terms, complete. The defense attorneys for both men, evaluating the same evidence, reached the same conclusion. The plea negotiations began in the spring of 2011 and continued through the summer. The prosecutors initially sought a sentence with significant state prison time, given the dollar amounts involved and the institutional position of trust the defendants had occupied. The defense pointed to the near-complete recovery of the January 30th cash, the defendants' lack of prior criminal records, and their willingness to plead guilty rather than try the case. The negotiations converged. On October 27, 2011, Coumar Persad and Davon Webb appeared in Queens County Supreme Court and pleaded guilty. Each entered pleas to grand larceny, obstructing governmental administration, and official misconduct. The grand larceny count, at the dollar level involved, was a Class C felony under New York penal law, with a statutory maximum of 15 years imprisonment. The plea agreement called for 6 months in jail plus 5 years probation for each defendant to be imposed at sentencing. The plea hearing was brief. The judge asked each defendant whether he understood the charges. Both answered yes. The judge asked each defendant whether he understood that he was waiving his right to a trial. Both answered yes. The judge asked each defendant to describe, in his own words, what he had done. Persad answered first. He described the X-ray, the call to Webb, the entry into the baggage handling area, the opening of the bag, the removal of the cash, the meeting in the bathroom, the division of the proceeds. He acknowledged that this had not been the only time. Webb followed and described in similar terms his role on the baggage belt side of the operation. Sentencing was scheduled for January 10, 2012. In the months between plea and sentencing, the Queens District Attorney's Office filed a sentencing memorandum that laid out the full scope of the case. The memorandum described the January 30th incident in detail. It described the broader pattern, the admitted total of approximately $160,000 across multiple thefts during the defendant's tenure at TSA. It described the operational architecture, the X-ray position, the baggage belt position, the phone coordination, the bathroom meeting, the years the practice had run. It described the institutional damage, the abuse of federal credentials, the violation of passengers' implicit trust in the agency, the reputational injury to the 50,000 officers nationwide who had not done what these two had done. The defense memoranda emphasized other factors. Persad was a 44-year-old father of 2 with no prior criminal history. Webb was a 31-year-old father with no prior criminal history. Both had cooperated. Both had pleaded guilty without forcing the prosecution to try the case. Approximately $39,980 of the $40,000 stolen on January 30th had been recovered. Both men had lost their federal employment, their pensions, and their ability to ever work in federal service again. Both men had spent the months since arrest under the strain of pending state court felony charges. On January 10, 2012, the court imposed sentence. Each defendant received 6 months in the New York City Department of Corrections custody, to be followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The court ordered the forfeiture of the recovered cash to the passenger whose bag had been opened. The court entered final judgments of conviction on the felony counts, which would, for the remainder of both men's lives, appear on every criminal background check, every employment application, every immigration form, and every housing inquiry either of them would ever face. Persad served his sentence at the Rikers Island complex. Webb served his at the same facility. Both were released within 6 months. Both began their probation terms in 2012. Both returned to families that had spent a year and a half watching the cases unfold in the New York newspapers. The Daily News and the New York Post had covered the arrests prominently, and CNN had run the story nationally on the day of the original charges. Persad returned to the house in Jackson Heights. The pension he had been accruing for 9 years was gone. The federal career he had built since 2002 was gone. The mango tree in the backyard, which had never produced fruit, was still there. Webb returned to the Bronx. He found work eventually, outside federal service, outside any role that required a clean background check, outside any role that would ever pay what TSA had paid. His daughter was old enough by then to understand what had happened. The neighborhood, like his family, absorbed the news and moved on. The TSA, in the years that followed, would continue to fire officers for theft from checked baggage. The 12-officer figure the agency cited in 2011 grew by 2014 to over 400. The Persad-Webb case, in the institutional history of the agency, became one of the clearest examples of the operational architecture of two-person insider theft at a major American airport. The kind of case that demonstrated, in its details, exactly how much could move through the federal baggage system before any element of the federal supervisory chain noticed. A single passenger checked a bag containing $170,000 in cash at JFK on January 30th, 2011. A federal X-ray screener saw it. A federal baggage handler marked it. The two of them met in a bathroom and divided $40,000 of it between them. They walked out of the terminal at the end of their shifts with the cash in their clothing. They had been doing this kind of thing, by their own admission, for years. The only reason any of it ended is that a colleague who has never been publicly named decided to walk down a hallway and tell a supervisor what was happening. That case was disturbing, but the case on the right-hand side is the one that pushed even the TSA to admit, in writing, that the system was broken. Click it now.